What would you do if the love of your life handed you divorce papers after you said you'd found someone better? How did I go from feeling powerful, sending that text, to watching my husband calmly gather evidence against me? Can betrayal really be justified? Or does the truth always come back to destroy the story you've built? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Eudora Finch, and I thought I had everything figured out. At 32, I worked as an administrative assistant at the Riverside Counseling Center, lived in a comfortable suburban townhouse with my husband Nate, and had 2 beautiful children. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself I deserved more. I deserved excitement. I deserved passion. I deserved someone who would make me feel alive again. That someone turned out to be Alexis Moran, the new counselor who started working at our office 3 months ago. Lex was everything Nate wasn't: spontaneous, flirty, and completely focused on me when we talked. While Nate buried himself in software engineering projects, Lex made me laugh. While Nate worried about mortgage payments and our kids' college funds, Lex talked about living in the moment. I should have seen the warning signs. I should have recognized what I was about to destroy. But I was too caught up in the intoxicating feeling of being desired to care about consequences. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and disappointment. I stood at the counter, my phone buzzing with another text from Lex, while Nate sat at our small dining table reviewing what looked like work documents. The morning light streaming through our kitchen window highlighted the grey streaks that had started appearing in his dark hair over the past year. When had he started looking so tired all the time? "You were out late again last night," Nate said without looking up from his laptop. His voice carried that careful tone he used when he was trying not to start a fight. "Ella asked where you were when I tucked her in." I deleted Lex's text without reading it and turned to face my husband of 5 years. "I told you, we had a staff meeting about the new client intake procedures. These things run long sometimes." "On a Thursday night, until almost 11. The suspicion in his voice made my chest tighten with irritation. This was exactly the problem with our marriage: Nate's constant need to monitor and control everything I did. When had he become so paranoid and suffocating? "Yes, Nate, some of us have jobs that require flexibility. Not everyone gets to work from home and set their own schedule like you do." I grabbed my coffee mug harder than necessary, the ceramic handle warm against my palm. "Maybe if you paid half as much attention to your family as you do to your precious code, you'd understand that my work is important too." Nate finally looked up, his brown eyes reflecting hurt that I chose to interpret as guilt. Good. Maybe now he'd realize how his neglect had been pushing me away for months. "I'm not trying to control you, Eudora. I'm worried about you. You've been distant lately, and the kids have noticed. Mason asked me yesterday if Mommy doesn't like living with us anymore." "Don't you dare use our children to manipulate me," I snapped. "Just because I'm not content to sit around this house every evening watching Netflix doesn't mean I don't love them. Maybe I need more stimulation than discussing Mason's kindergarten finger painting projects and Ella's spelling tests." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. Nate needed to understand that I was more than just a wife and mother. I was a woman with needs and desires that weren't being met. My phone buzzed again. This time I couldn't help glancing at it, and I saw Lex's name on the screen. My pulse quickened involuntarily. "Who keeps texting you?" Nate asked. "Probably my sister. Tessa's been having drama with her roommate again." The lie rolled off my tongue so easily it surprised me. "Look, I need to get ready for work. Can we not start every morning with an interrogation?" Nate closed his laptop and stood up, his 6-foot frame filling the small kitchen space. "This isn't an interrogation. This is your husband trying to understand why you seem to hate being around your own family." "I don't hate being around my family," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were true. When had coming home started feeling like a burden instead of a refuge? I just need space to breathe. You're suffocating me, Nate. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. The hurt was still there, but underneath it was something that looked almost like resignation. Okay, he said quietly. I'll give you space. As he walked out of the kitchen, I heard my phone buzz again. This time, I waited until I heard his office door close before I checked the message. Good morning, beautiful. Can't wait to see you today. Last night was incredible. I smiled despite myself, remembering how Lex had made me feel the night before. Alive, desired, important. Everything Nate used to make me feel but hadn't in years. I was deleting the text when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly shoving my phone into my purse, I turned to see Nate entering the kitchen again, his expression unreadable. I forgot my travel mug, he said, reaching around me to grab it from the counter. My phone buzzed again from inside my purse, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Nate's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. Instead, he just filled his mug with coffee and headed for the door. Have a good day at work, Eudora, he said without looking back. After he left, I pulled out my phone to read Lex's latest message. Meet me for lunch. I have something special planned. My heart raced as I typed back, yes, can't wait. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. Nate had pushed me to this point with his neglect and controlling behavior. If he had been a better husband, I wouldn't need to look elsewhere for the attention and excitement I craved. But as I got ready for work, I couldn't shake the image of his face when he'd heard my phone buzzing. There had been something in his eyes, not just suspicion, but a kind of careful watchfulness that made me uncomfortable. I pushed the feeling away. Nate was just being paranoid, like always. He had no real reason to suspect anything. At least, I hoped he didn't. The Riverside Counseling Center occupied a converted Victorian house on the edge of downtown, its cheerful yellow exterior hiding the complicated emotional dramas that played out within its walls daily. I'd worked there for 3 years, handling scheduling, insurance verification, and client intake paperwork. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well and the benefits were decent. More importantly, it was where I'd met Lex. I arrived that morning to find her already in the break room, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee and that smile that never failed to make my stomach flutter. At 29, Lex had the kind of effortless confidence I'd always envied in other women. Her dark hair was perfectly tousled, her makeup subtle but flawless, and she had a way of making even our standard-issue polo shirts look stylish. "There's my favorite administrator," she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to make me feel special without being obvious to anyone who might overhear. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone professional, even as I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "How was your evening?" "Lonely," she said, and the way she looked at me made it clear she wasn't talking about being alone in general. "I kept thinking about our conversation yesterday, about how you deserve someone who really sees you. 3 months ago, when Lex had first started working here, I would have been horrified by this kind of attention from a coworker. But 3 months ago, I hadn't realized how starved I was for someone to make me feel like I mattered." "Eudora, there you are." I turned to see Margaret Chen, our office manager, standing in the doorway with a stack of files. Margaret was in her 50s, had worked here for over a decade, and had a reputation for seeing everything that happened in the office. "We need to discuss the new client protocols," Margaret continued, her eyes flicking between Lex and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Could you come to my office when you have a moment?" "Of course," I said, but Margaret had already turned and walked away. Lex waited until Margaret's footsteps faded before moving closer to me. "She doesn't like me," she said quietly. "Margaret doesn't like anyone at first. She's just protective of the office dynamic. Or maybe she's noticed how I look at you." Lex's hand brushed against mine as she reached for the coffee pot, and the brief contact sent electricity up my arm. Some people are very observant about these things. The implication in her words should have worried me more than it did. Instead, I found myself thrilled by the idea that our connection was obvious to others. It made it feel more real, more significant. I should go see what Margaret needs, I said, but I didn't move away from Lex. Have lunch with me today, Lex said. There's a new place downtown I want to try. We could talk more about things. I knew I should say no. I knew that having lunch alone with Lex was crossing a line I hadn't crossed yet. But the thought of spending an hour in her undivided attention, feeling important and desired, was too tempting to resist. Okay, I said, but somewhere discreet. You know how people in small offices talk. Lex smiled, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. Don't worry, I'll take good care of you. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of anticipation. I processed intake forms and scheduled appointments while counting down the minutes until lunch. When Margaret called me into her office to discuss the client protocols, I found myself barely listening to her explanations about documentation requirements and confidentiality procedures. Is everything all right, Eudora? Margaret asked, interrupting her own explanation about insurance verification processes. You seem distracted today. I'm fine, I said quickly. Just tired. Nate and I were up late last night discussing some family stuff. Margaret nodded, but her expression remained concerned. How are things at home? I know it can be challenging to balance work and family, especially with young children. For a moment I considered telling her the truth, that things at home felt stagnant and suffocating, that I felt invisible and unappreciated, that I was desperately craving something more exciting than discussions about grocery budgets and parent-teacher conferences. But Margaret was Nate's age, had been married to the same man for 25 years, and probably wouldn't understand. Things are fine, I said instead, just the usual challenges. Well, if you ever need to talk, you know I'm here. Sometimes it helps to have an outside perspective on these things. After I left Margaret's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that she suspected something. The way she'd looked at me, the pointed questions about my home life, it felt like she was trying to warn me about something. But when lunchtime arrived and I met Lex in the parking lot, all my concerns evaporated. She had changed out of her work polo into a flowing blouse that made her look even more beautiful, and she greeted me with a hug that lasted just a little too long to be purely friendly. Ready for an adventure? She asked, and I found myself nodding eagerly. The restaurant she'd chosen was across town, far enough from our office that we were unlikely to run into coworkers. As we sat across from each other in a corner booth, Lex reached across the table and took my hand. I've been thinking about you all morning, she said, about us, about what this could be. Lex, I started to say something about being married, about having children, about all the reasons this was complicated, but she squeezed my hand, and the words died in my throat. I know it's complicated, she said, as if reading my mind, but sometimes the most worthwhile things are. You deserve to be happy, Eudora. You deserve to be with someone who makes you feel alive. My marriage it's not what it used to be, I found myself saying. Nate and I have grown apart. We're more like roommates than husband and wife. It wasn't entirely true, or at least it wasn't the whole truth. But sitting there with Lex, feeling more connected to another person than I had in months, it felt true enough. That must be so lonely for you, Lex said, her thumb stroking across my knuckles. A woman like you shouldn't have to settle for a relationship that doesn't fulfill her. We talked for over an hour, and with every minute that passed, I felt myself falling deeper into whatever this was between us. Lex made me feel interesting and desirable in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. When she suggested we extend our lunch break and take a walk in the park nearby, I agreed without hesitation. It was during that walk, as we sat on a bench overlooking the duck pond, that Lex kissed me for the first time. I should have pulled away. I should have remembered my wedding vows, my children, my husband waiting at home. Instead, I kissed her back, and for those few moments, nothing else in the world seemed to matter. When we finally broke apart, Lex smiled and said, "I've been wanting to do that since the day I met you." "We should get back to work," I said, but I made no move to stand up. "In a minute," Lex said, and kissed me again. By the time we returned to the office, we were 45 minutes late. Margaret was waiting for me at my desk with a concerned expression. "Where were you? You missed the 2 o'clock client intake appointment." "I'm so sorry," I said, scrambling to come up with an explanation. "We got caught in traffic coming back from lunch." Margaret's eyes flicked to Lex, who was walking calmly to her own office as if nothing had happened. "Traffic," Margaret repeated, her tone neutral but skeptical. "Yes, there was construction on 5th Street. I should have called." "Yes, you should have." Margaret handed me a file. "I rescheduled Mrs. Patterson for tomorrow morning. Please make sure you're available." As Margaret walked away, I caught sight of Janet Rodriguez from accounting, standing near the copy machine. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and I realized she must have seen Lex and me return together. My phone buzzed with a text from Lex. "Worth every minute. Can't wait to see you again." I deleted the message quickly, but not before I noticed Janet was still watching me. When our eyes met, she looked away, but something in her expression made my stomach tighten with anxiety. For the first time since this had all started, I wondered if I was being reckless. But then I remembered the way Lex had made me feel during lunch, alive, desired, important, and I pushed my concerns aside. I deserved to be happy, and if that happiness came with some risk, well, maybe that just made it more exciting. 2 weeks later, I was sitting across from Olivia Carver at Brewster's Cafe, trying to pretend this was just a normal coffee date with my mother-in-law. But the tension in Olivia's posture and the careful way she stirred her latte told me this conversation was going to be anything but normal. At 61, Olivia had the kind of understated elegance that came from decades of teaching high school English. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her clothes tasteful and well-coordinated. She'd been nothing but kind to me since Nate and I got married, welcoming me into the family with genuine warmth, which made what I was about to do even more necessary. "How are things at work, dear?" Olivia asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Fine," I replied, glancing around the cafe. I'd chosen this place specifically because it was popular with young professionals, the kind of place where I might reasonably run into Lex. "Busy, but I like staying active." "And how are Nate and the children?" Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. There was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there when we'd first sat down. "They're fine too. Why do you ask?" Olivia set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Eudora, I'm going to be direct with you because I care about this family. There are rumors circulating about you and that new counselor at your office." My heart started pounding, but I kept my expression neutral. "Rumors?" "Janet Rodriguez's daughter works at your office. She's mentioned seeing you and this woman together quite frequently, having very intimate conversations, leaving together for extended lunch breaks." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. "Janet's daughter is mistaken. Lex and I are colleagues. Sometimes we discuss work matters over lunch. There's nothing inappropriate about that." "Lex," Olivia repeated. "That's her name." I realized my mistake immediately, but it was too late to take it back. "Alexis Moran. She's a licensed counselor. We work together on client intake procedures." "I see." Olivia leaned forward slightly. "Eudora, I've known you for 5 years. I've watched you with my son, seen how much you love each other. But lately, Nate has been different, worried. He's mentioned that you've been distant, that you're staying out late more often." "Your son has always been controlling," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "Just because I'm not content to sit at home every evening discussing his work projects doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong." Olivia's expression shifted, and I saw a flash of something that might have been anger. "Controlling? Nate is one of the most respectful, considerate men I know." If he's concerned about his wife's behavior, it's because he loves you and wants to protect his family. Protect his family from what exactly? I demanded. From me having friends? From me having a life outside of our house? From you destroying your marriage for a workplace infatuation? The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could have backed down, could have reassured Olivia that she was wrong, could have promised to be more mindful of appearances. Instead, I felt a surge of defiant anger. You've never liked me, I said. From the beginning, you've thought Nate could do better. You've always looked at me like I wasn't good enough for your precious son. That's not true. It is true. And now you're looking for any excuse to blame me for the problems in our marriage. Well, maybe if Nate had put half as much energy into being a husband as he does into his software projects, I wouldn't need to look elsewhere for companionship. Olivia's face went pale. Elsewhere for companionship? Are you admitting? I'm admitting that I deserve to be happy. I deserve to be with someone who makes me feel alive and appreciated. Someone who sees me as more than just a wife and mother. As if summoned by my words, I saw Lex enter the cafe. She spotted me immediately and smiled, that warm, intimate smile that never failed to make my heart race. Without hesitation, she walked over to our table. Eudora, what a lovely surprise, Lex said, her hand coming to rest on my shoulder, in a gesture that was clearly more than friendly. I was just thinking about our conversation yesterday. I felt Olivia's sharp intake of breath, but I didn't look at her. Instead, I smiled up at Lex and said, Lex, I'd like you to meet my mother-in-law, Olivia Carver. Olivia, this is Alexis Moran, my colleague I was telling you about. Lex extended her hand with confident grace. It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Carver. Eudora talks about her family all the time. Olivia shook Lex's hand briefly, her expression carefully controlled. How nice to meet you, Miss Moran. I understand you work with Eudora at the counseling center. I do. She's been incredibly helpful in getting me settled. We've become quite close. Lex's hand squeezed my shoulder gently. Actually, I was hoping to steal her away for a quick lunch if you ladies are finished with your coffee. The presumption in Lex's words, the casual way she was treating my time as available to her, should have embarrassed me. Instead, I felt a thrill of excitement. This was exactly what I'd been craving. Someone who wanted my company, who made me feel desired and important. We were just finishing up, I said, standing and gathering my purse. Olivia, thank you for the coffee. We should do this again soon. Olivia remained seated, looking up at me with an expression of profound disappointment. Eudora, please think about what you're doing. Think about Ella and Mason. Think about the life you've built with my son. I am thinking about them, I replied. I'm thinking about showing my children that their mother is a woman who refuses to settle for less than she deserves. As Lex and I walked away, I heard Olivia call out, Eudora, please. But I didn't turn around. At the cafe entrance, Lex paused and looked back at the table where Olivia still sat, her face stricken. Was that wise? Lex asked quietly. Probably not, I admitted, but I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending to be someone I'm not to make other people comfortable. Lex smiled and took my hand, right there in the cafe doorway where anyone could see. Good for you. You deserve to be brave enough to choose your own happiness. That evening, I came home to find Nate waiting for me in the living room. Ella was curled up on the couch next to him, reading a book, while Mason played with building blocks on the floor. It was the kind of peaceful family scene that once would have filled me with contentment. Now it just felt suffocating. How is your coffee with my mother? Nate asked, his tone carefully neutral. Fine, I said, not meeting his eyes. She wanted to catch up. She called me afterward. She seemed upset. I felt Ella's eyes on me and realized she was listening to our conversation. Can we discuss this later, when the children aren't around? Of course. Nate's voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it that I'd never heard before. Something that sounded almost like resignation. Kids, why don't you go wash up for dinner? After Ella and Mason had left the room, Nate looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. My mother thinks you're having an affair. The direct statement caught me off guard. I'd expected more careful questioning, more dancing around the subject. Your mother has always been dramatic. Are you, Eudora? Are you having an affair? I could have lied. I could have denied everything and bought myself more time. Instead, I felt that same surge of defiant anger that had overtaken me at the cafe. What if I am? I said. What if I found someone who actually appreciates me? Someone who makes me feel like I matter? Nate's face went very still. Is that a yes? It's a, maybe you should have thought about that before you started taking me for granted. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then Nate nodded slowly and said, Okay, I think I understand now. Do you? Do you understand that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being invisible in my own marriage? I understand that you've made your choice, Nate said quietly, and now I need to make mine. Something in his tone made me pause, but before I could ask what he meant, Ella appeared in the doorway. Daddy, I can't find my toothbrush, she said, her voice small and uncertain. I'll help you look for it, sweetheart, Nate said, standing up. As he walked past me, he paused and said quietly, We'll continue this conversation later. But we never did. By the time I'd finished cleaning up from dinner, Nate had retreated to his office and closed the door. And when I went to bed that night, I found a text from Lex waiting for me. Thinking about you. Today felt like a new beginning. I smiled as I typed back, It did. I'm ready for whatever comes next. I had no idea what I'd just set in motion. The call from Ella's school came on a Thursday morning while I was at my desk, trying to focus on scheduling appointments instead of the growing tension at home. Nate had been sleeping in the guest room for 3 days, and the children had started asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. Mrs. Carver, this is Patricia Williams, the school counselor at Riverside Elementary. I'm calling about Ella. My stomach dropped. Is she hurt? What happened? She's not injured, but she's been having some behavioral concerns this week. Crying during class, difficulty concentrating, and yesterday, she told her teacher that her parents don't love each other anymore. I was hoping we could schedule a meeting to discuss what might be going on at home. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar surge of irritation. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. Everyone treating me like the villain when all I was doing was trying to find some happiness in my life. There have been some changes in our family dynamic lately, I said carefully, but nothing that should be affecting Ella's schoolwork. Children are very perceptive about family stress, Mrs. Carver. Even when parents think they're hiding their problems, kids usually sense the tension. Has there been any conflict at home recently? My husband and I are working through some issues, I admitted, but we're both committed to minimizing the impact on our children. I'm sure you are, but I think it would be helpful if we could meet in person to discuss some strategies for supporting Ella during this difficult time. Would you and Mr. Carver be available tomorrow afternoon? The thought of sitting in a meeting with Nate, pretending we were a united front while discussing our daughter's distress, made me feel sick. I'll have to check our schedules and get back to you. After I hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen without seeing it. This was Nate's fault. If he hadn't been so controlling and suspicious, if he'd made more effort to connect with me emotionally, none of this would be happening. Now his hurt feelings were affecting our children, and somehow I was going to be blamed for that too. Rough morning. I looked up to see Lex standing beside my desk with 2 cups of coffee, and that sympathetic smile that never failed to make me feel better. Ella's school counselor wants to meet with Nate and me tomorrow. Apparently she's been upset in class. Lex set one of the coffee cups on my desk and perched on the edge, close enough that I could smell her perfume. That must be so stressful for you. It's not fair that you're dealing with the fallout from Nate's emotional immaturity. That's exactly what it is, I said, grateful that someone finally understood. He's the one who's been cold and distant, but when I find happiness elsewhere, suddenly I'm the bad guy. You're not the bad guy, Eudora. You're a woman who deserves love and passion and excitement. If Nate can't provide that, it's not your fault that someone else can. Lex's hand brushed against mine as she handed me the coffee, and I felt that familiar flutter of excitement. Even in the middle of all this stress, she could still make me feel desirable and important. "What are you going to tell the school counselor?" Lex asked. "I don't know. The truth, I suppose. That Nate and I have grown apart and we're trying to figure out what comes next." "And what does come next? For us, I mean." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and danger. I knew what Lex was really asking, whether I was ready to leave my marriage for her. A month ago, the idea would have terrified me. Now, sitting in my dreary office cubicle, thinking about going home to a husband who barely spoke to me and children who sensed the tension even when we tried to hide it, the prospect of starting over with someone who truly wanted me felt almost liberating. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I know I can't keep living the way I have been." Lex smiled and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm here for you. You know that, right?" Before I could respond, I heard Margaret's voice from across the office. "Eudora, could I see you in my office, please?" Lex slipped away as I walked to Margaret's office, trying to ignore the curious looks from my co-workers. Margaret closed the door behind me and gestured for me to sit down. "I've received some concerns about your professional conduct," Margaret said without preamble. "What kind of concerns?" "Multiple staff members have reported that you and Alexis Moran appear to be having a personal relationship that's affecting your work performance. Extended lunch breaks, intimate conversations during office hours, and yesterday, Janet Rodriguez saw you holding hands in the parking lot." Heat flooded my cheeks. My personal relationships are not the office's business. They are when they affect your job performance and create an uncomfortable work environment for other employees. You missed 2 client appointments last week, and your attention during staff meetings has been noticeably lacking. I've been dealing with some family stress. Which brings me to my next point. Several people have mentioned that you've been discussing your marriage problems with Alexis during work hours. That's inappropriate for multiple reasons, not least of which is that it puts her in an awkward position as a licensed counselor. I felt a surge of anger at the unfairness of the situation. So now I'm not allowed to have friends at work. I'm not allowed to seek support when I'm going through a difficult time. You're allowed to have appropriate professional relationships with your co-workers. What you're not allowed to do is conduct a romantic affair on company time. The word affair hit me like a slap. Hearing it stated so bluntly made everything feel suddenly real and sordid in a way I'd been avoiding. "I think you're misinterpreting the situation," I said weakly. Margaret leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Eudora, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen workplace relationships develop before, and I understand how these things can happen. But you have a family to consider, and Alexis has a professional reputation to protect. Whatever is going on between you two needs to stop, or I'm going to have to take formal disciplinary action." "Are you threatening to fire me?" "I'm trying to help you make better choices before this situation gets worse. Go home, talk to your husband, and think seriously about what you're doing. Take tomorrow off if you need to, but when you come back on Monday, I need to see a clear commitment to appropriate professional boundaries." I left Margaret's office feeling humiliated and angry. How dare they judge me for finding happiness with someone who actually cared about me? How dare they act like I was some kind of predator when all I was doing was responding to genuine affection from someone who saw my worth? I was so caught up in my indignation that I almost missed the group of co-workers clustered around Janet Rodriguez's desk, their conversation stopping abruptly when they saw me. But I did notice the way they looked at me, not with curiosity or concern, but with the kind of judgment usually reserved for people who'd committed serious social transgressions. Word was already spreading. By Monday, everyone in the office would know about Lex and me. The thought should have mortified me, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief. At least now I wouldn't have to pretend anymore. I found Lex in her office, packing up her things for the day. "How did it go with Margaret?" she asked. "About as well as you'd expect. She wants me to end things with you or face disciplinary action." Lex's expression darkened. "That's discrimination. She can't control your personal life. She can if it affects my work performance. And apparently, several people have noticed our friendship. So what do you want to do?" I looked at Lex, beautiful, confident, completely focused on me, and felt that familiar surge of defiant determination. "I want to stop hiding," I said. "I want to be with someone who makes me happy, and I want everyone to know it." Lex smiled and moved closer to me. "Are you sure? Once we go public, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I said, and in that moment I truly believed I was. That evening, I came home to find Nate in the kitchen making dinner, while Mason and Ella sat at the table working on homework. It was such a normal, domestic scene that for a moment I felt a pang of something that might have been regret. "How was your day?" Nate asked without looking at me. "Complicated," I said. "We need to talk. After the kids are in bed." But I was tired of waiting, tired of tiptoeing around the truth. "Actually, I think we should talk now. The children are old enough to understand that sometimes adults need to make difficult decisions." Nate turned to look at me, and I saw wariness in his eyes. "Eudora, I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about making choices, and you're right, I have made my choice." I pulled out my phone and typed quickly, "I found someone better. You need to let me go." I hit send and watched Nate's phone buzz on the counter. He picked it up, read the message, and for a long moment the kitchen was completely silent. Then he set the phone down and said, very quietly, "Okay." "Okay?" I'd been expecting anger, arguments, maybe even tears. His calm acceptance was somehow more unsettling than any dramatic reaction would have been. "Okay," he repeated. "I understand." Ella looked up from her homework, her 8-year-old face creased with confusion. "What's happening? Why does Mummy look angry?" "Mummy's not angry, sweetheart," Nate said gently. She's decided she wants to live somewhere else for a while." "Like a vacation?" Mason asked hopefully. I opened my mouth to explain, to find words that would make this easier for them to understand, but Nate spoke first. "Something like that. Why don't you two finish your homework in the living room? I need to talk to Mommy for a few more minutes." After the children left, Nate looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I hope she makes you happy, Eudora. I really do." The kindness in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. It made me feel small and petty in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. "This isn't about hurting you," I said. "This is about me finally choosing to be happy." "I know," Nate said, "and I hope you are. Happy, I mean." As I walked upstairs to pack a bag, I told myself this was the right decision. I was choosing love over obligation, passion over routine, excitement over security. I was being brave enough to pursue the life I deserved. But as I heard Ella crying softly in her room, and Mason asking Nate why Mommy was putting clothes in a suitcase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a terrible mistake. 3 weeks after I moved out, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, trying to explain why I deserved half of everything Nate and I had built together, plus alimony, plus primary custody of the children. The lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Kellerman, who specialized in complex family situations, listened to my story with professional neutrality. "So you left the marital home to pursue a relationship with a coworker," she summarized, "and now you want to file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences." "I want to file for divorce citing emotional neglect," I corrected. Nate was emotionally unavailable for months. He prioritized his work over his family, made no effort to connect with me as a woman, and created an environment where I felt invisible and unappreciated. Patricia made notes on her legal pad. "Do you have documentation of this emotional neglect?" counseling records, journal entries, witnesses who can testify to his behavior. No, but anyone who knows us can see how he's always been more focused on his career than his family. Mrs. Carver, I need to be direct with you. Emotional neglect is very difficult to prove in court, especially when you've left the marriage for another relationship. It's going to look like you're trying to justify infidelity by blaming your husband's character. It wasn't infidelity, I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. My marriage was already over emotionally. I just found the courage to admit it. I understand your perspective, but legally speaking, you engaged in an extramarital relationship while still married. That's adultery, regardless of the state of your emotional connection to your husband. The word adultery sounded harsh and judgmental in the sterile law office. I'd been trying to avoid thinking of my relationship with Lex in those terms, preferring to see it as a natural progression from an emotionally dead marriage to a vibrant new love. What about the children? I asked. Surely the court will see that they need their mother. Tell me about your current living situation. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. I'm staying with Lex temporarily while I look for my own place. It's just until I get back on my feet financially. And how are the children adjusting to this arrangement? That was the question I'd been dreading. The truth was, Ella and Mason were not adjusting well at all. My visits with them had been strained and awkward, with Ella barely speaking to me, and Mason clinging to Nate whenever I tried to hug him. Last week, Ella had asked me point blank why I didn't love Daddy anymore, and I hadn't known how to answer. They're having some difficulty with the transition, I admitted, but that's normal for children of divorce. Once things settle down and they see how much happier I am, they'll understand. Patricia's expression suggested she was less optimistic about this outcome. Mrs. Carver, I have to ask, have you considered reconciliation, marriage counseling? It might be worth exploring whether these problems can be resolved before proceeding with divorce. No, I said firmly. I've moved on. I'm in love with someone else now, and I'm not going back to a marriage that was making me miserable. I see. Well, let's discuss what you're hoping to achieve in the divorce settlement. I outlined my expectations. Half the house value, half of Nate's retirement accounts, spousal support for at least 5 years, and primary custody with generous child support. It seemed reasonable to me. After all, I'd contributed 5 years of my life to building our family, and I deserved to be compensated for that investment. Patricia listened without comment, then set down her pen and looked at me seriously. Mrs. Carver, I need to manage your expectations. Given that you left the marriage for another relationship, and given that you're currently cohabiting with that person, it's unlikely that a judge will award you primary custody or significant alimony. Why not? I'm their mother. I've been the primary caregiver. Have you? Who handles the children's doctor appointments, school conferences, extracurricular activities? I paused, realizing with uncomfortable clarity that Nate had actually handled most of those responsibilities. He was the one who remembered vaccination schedules and permission slip deadlines. He was the one who helped with homework every night while I was working late or, more recently, spending time with Lex. We shared those responsibilities, I said weakly. I see. And financially, how much do you contribute to the household income? My salary covers about 30% of our expenses, I admitted, but I also handle all the household management, the cooking, the cleaning. Did you handle those things, or did you share them with your husband? Again, I was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Nate had always been an equal partner in household tasks. He cooked dinner at least half the time, did his own laundry, helped clean the house on weekends. I'd been so focused on feeling unappreciated that I'd somehow convinced myself I was doing everything, when in reality, we'd had a fairly equitable division of labor. Look, I said, feeling defensive, the point is that I deserve to be compensated for the years I invested in this marriage. I gave up career opportunities to support Nate's ambitions. I deserve security as I start over. What career opportunities did you give up? The question caught me off guard. The truth was, I'd never had particularly ambitious career goals. My job at the counseling center was the best position I'd ever held, and I'd gotten it after we were married. But admitting that would undermine my argument. I could have pursued additional education, advanced my career, if I hadn't been focused on supporting our family, I said. Patricia made more notes, her expression neutral but somehow skeptical. We'll certainly make those arguments, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the settlement might not be as generous as you're hoping. What do you mean? I mean that judges tend to be unsympathetic to spouses who leave their marriages for other relationships and then claim financial hardship, especially when there are children involved. I left the lawyer's office feeling frustrated and misunderstood. Everyone seemed determined to paint me as the villain in this situation, when all I'd done was choose happiness over settling for less than I deserved. But my frustration turned to genuine alarm when I got home to find Lex pacing around her apartment with a worried expression. "We need to talk," she said as soon as I walked in. "What's wrong?" "I got called into my supervisor's office today. Apparently, your husband has been making inquiries about our relationship." My blood ran cold. "What kind of inquiries?" "He contacted the counseling center's administration and filed a formal complaint about my professional conduct. He's claiming that I initiated an inappropriate relationship with a married client's family member." "But I'm not a client." "No, but you work there and there are ethical guidelines about relationships between staff members and community members that could be interpreted to cover our situation." I sank onto Lex's couch, feeling the walls closing in around me. "What did you tell your supervisor?" "I told them the truth, that we developed feelings for each other naturally, that you were already having marital problems when we met, and that I never did anything to encourage you to leave your husband." And they're launching a formal investigation. I could lose my license, Eudora. Everything I've worked for, my entire career, it could all be gone because of this. For the first time since this had all started, I felt a genuine stab of guilt. I'd been so focused on my own happiness that I hadn't fully considered the consequences for Lex. She'd been nothing but supportive and loving, and now her professional life was in jeopardy because of me. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I never wanted this to hurt you." Lex sat down beside me and took my hand, but her usual warmth seemed strained. "I know you didn't, but we need to think about what we're going to do. If I lose my license, I'll have to start over completely. And frankly, I'm not sure I can afford to support both of us while you're going through your divorce." The implication was clear. If this relationship became too costly for Lex, she might reconsider whether it was worth it. The thought terrified me more than I wanted to admit. "Maybe I should talk to Nate," I said. "Ask him to drop the complaint." Lex's expression darkened. "Absolutely not. That would just give him more ammunition to use against you in the divorce. We need to be smart about this." "Then what do you suggest?" "I think we need to be more discreet for a while. Maybe you should get your own place, at least until the divorce is finalized and the investigation is complete." The suggestion felt like a rejection, even though I knew Lex was being practical. "You want me to move out?" "I want us to protect what we have. Sometimes that means making temporary sacrifices for long-term security." That night, lying in Lex's bed while she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how everything had gotten so complicated. 3 months ago, I'd been a married woman with a stable job and a comfortable life. Now I was facing a contentious divorce, potential homelessness, and the possibility that the woman I'd left everything for might not be as committed to our relationship as I'd believed. For the first time since I'd sent that text to Nate, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to go back now. I'd burned those bridges when I chose to humiliate him publicly, when I'd moved in with Lex, when I'd forced my children to choose sides in a conflict they were too young to understand. All I could do now was hope that somehow everything would work out in my favor. I had no idea that Nate was 3 steps ahead of me, methodically building a case that would soon make my hopes irrelevant. The mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in downtown's family court building. I arrived with Patricia, expecting to negotiate a reasonable settlement with Nate and his lawyer. What I found instead was a conference room that looked more like a prosecutor's office, with boxes of documents, printed photographs, and a timeline chart that covered half the wall. Nate sat across from me looking calm and composed, flanked by his attorney, David Morrison, who had a reputation for being methodical and thorough. Between them sat a woman I didn't recognize. Later, I learned she was a forensic accountant they'd hired to analyze our finances. "Good morning, Eudora," Nate said politely, as if we were acquaintances meeting for coffee rather than estranged spouses dividing up the remains of our marriage. "Let's begin," said the mediator, a grey-haired woman named Judge Patricia Hamilton, who'd been handling family cases for over 20 years. "I understand we're here to discuss custody arrangements and asset division. Mr. Morrison, would you like to present your client's position?" Morrison opened the first box and began laying out documents with the precision of a surgeon. "Your Honor, we believe the evidence will show that Mrs. Carver abandoned her family responsibilities to pursue an extramarital relationship, and that she has subsequently engaged in behavior that demonstrates poor judgment and priorities incompatible with primary custody." "That's ridiculous," I said, but Patricia placed a warning hand on my arm. "Let's see the evidence," Judge Hamilton said. Morrison began with phone records, page after page of text messages between Lex and me, including some that were embarrassingly intimate and others where I'd complained bitterly about Nate and the children. Seeing our private conversations laid out in black and white made them seem tawdry and cruel in a way I hadn't recognized at the time. "These messages span a period of 6 weeks before Mrs. Carver left the marital home," Morrison explained. "During this time, she was regularly meeting with Ms. Moran during work hours, lying to her husband about her whereabouts, and expressing resentment toward her children for interfering with her social plans." "I never resented my children," I protested. Morrison handed the mediator a printed text message. Quote, "Can't wait to be done with soccer practice and parent-teacher conferences and all the other mind-numbing responsibilities that keep me from having a real life." End quote. This was sent to Ms. Moran on March 15th, the same day as Ella's spring concert that Mrs. Carver chose not to attend. I felt heat flood my cheeks. I remembered that text, sent during a particularly frustrating day when I'd felt trapped by domestic obligations. But seeing it presented as evidence of my fitness as a mother made it sound much worse than I'd intended. "Context matters," Patricia interjected. My client was expressing frustration about feeling overwhelmed, not rejecting her parental responsibilities. "Let's look at more context then," Morrison said, pulling out a thick folder. Security camera footage from the Riverside Counseling Center parking lot, showing Mrs. Carver and Ms. Moran in intimate embraces on 17 different occasions during work hours. GPS data from Mrs. Carver's phone showing extended visits to hotels and restaurants during times she told her husband she was working late. Credit card records showing purchases of lingerie and expensive dinners that she hid from her spouse. Each piece of evidence felt like a physical blow. I'd known Nate was hurt and angry, but I hadn't realized he'd been systematically documenting my behavior for weeks. The man I'd dismissed as passive and inattentive had been quietly building a case against me with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to his software projects. Furthermore, Morrison continued, we have testimony from Mrs. Carver's own co-workers about her declining job performance, her inappropriate conduct in the workplace, and her discussions of personal matters during professional hours. He handed over a stack of written statements. I recognized the names: Margaret, Janet Rodriguez, even some people I'd considered friends. They'd all provided detailed accounts of my behavior over the past few months, and none of them were flattering. Your Honor, Patricia said, while my client acknowledges that her marriage ended badly, none of this evidence suggests she's an unfit mother. She's never been abusive or neglectful toward her children. Let's discuss that, Morrison said, pulling out another folder. School records show that Ella Carver's grades have dropped significantly since her mother left home. She's been seeing the school counselor weekly for anxiety and behavioral issues. Mason has been asking his teachers when his mommy is coming home and whether it's his fault that she left. I felt tears sting my eyes. They're adjusting to a difficult situation. That's normal for children of divorce. Is it normal for a mother to tell her 8-year-old daughter that daddy doesn't love mommy anymore, and that's why she had to find someone who does? Morrison asked, consulting his notes. Because according to the school counselor's report, that's what Ella told her teacher last week. I was trying to help her understand. You were trying to make your children choose sides in an adult conflict, Morrison interrupted, just like you did when you brought Ms. Moran to Mason's birthday party last month and introduced her as Mommy's special friend. I remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. I'd thought bringing Lex to Mason's party would show the children that I was happy and that they should be happy for me. Instead, it had been awkward and uncomfortable, with Mason clinging to Nate and Ella refusing to speak to either Lex or me. Let's talk about finances, Morrison continued, apparently not done with his systematic destruction of my character. Mrs. Carver is requesting spousal support based on her claim that she sacrificed career advancement for the marriage. However, the evidence shows that her salary has actually increased by 30% since the marriage began, and that Mr. Carver has consistently supported her professional development, including paying for continuing education courses she never completed. He produced copies of my employment records, showing that far from sacrificing my career for marriage, I'd actually achieved the best job of my life after Nate and I got together. It was hard to argue that I'd been held back professionally when the evidence clearly showed the opposite. As for her current financial needs, Morrison continued, Mrs. Carver is cohabiting with Ms. Moran, who earns a comparable salary. She has chosen to leave her stable family situation for a relationship that provides her with both emotional and financial support. It's difficult to argue that she needs additional spousal support under these circumstances. Judge Hamilton had been taking notes throughout Morrison's presentation. Now she looked at me directly. Mrs. Carver, would you like to respond to any of these allegations? I looked at the evidence spread across the table. The text messages, the photographs, the timeline of my deception, and realized that there was no response that would make me look better. Everything Morrison had presented was true. I had been lying to my husband, neglecting my children's emotional needs, and prioritizing my own happiness over my family's stability. I made mistakes, I said quietly, but I was trying to save myself from a marriage that was making me miserable. I deserve to be happy too. Of course you do, Judge Hamilton said gently. But the question before us today is what arrangement will be in the best interests of your children, and what financial settlement reflects the actual circumstances of your marriage. She spent the next hour outlining her recommendations. Nate would have primary custody, with me getting alternating weekends and one evening per week. The house would be sold, with proceeds split 60-40 in Nate's favor due to his larger financial contribution. I would receive a small settlement from his retirement account, but no ongoing spousal support, given my decision to cohabitate with another partner. This is completely unfair, I said, my voice rising. I'm being punished for leaving an unhappy marriage. I'm being treated like a criminal for choosing love over obligation. You're being held accountable for the choices you made and the way you made them, Judge Hamilton replied. If you had handled your marital problems differently, through counseling, honest communication, or even a straightforward request for divorce, the outcome might be different. But you chose deception, abandonment, and behavior that prioritized your desires over your children's well-being. I want to contest this, I said to Patricia. I want to take this to trial. Patricia looked at the evidence spread across the table, then back at me. Eudora, I strongly advise you to accept the settlement. If we go to trial, the judge will see all the same evidence, but in a more public forum. Your chances of getting a better outcome are minimal, and the legal costs could be significant. So that's it. Nate gets everything he wants, and I get nothing. You get the opportunity to rebuild your life, Judge Hamilton said. You get to maintain a relationship with your children, though it will require you to demonstrate that their well-being is your priority. And you get to pursue the relationship that was apparently worth risking everything else. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Nate approached me in the hallway outside the mediation room. For a moment, I thought he might gloat or express anger about everything that had happened. Instead, he just looked tired. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Eudora," he said quietly. "I really do hope you're happy." "Are you?" I asked. "Happy, I mean." He considered the question seriously. "I'm relieved. For the first time in months, I know where I stand and what I need to do to take care of our children. That's not the same as happy, but it's better than the uncertainty we've been living with." "I never meant for things to get this complicated." "I know," he said, "but they did get complicated, and now we have to deal with the consequences." As I watched him walk away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, genuine regret. Not regret about leaving the marriage, I still believed that was the right choice, but regret about how I'd handled everything. The lying, the public humiliation, the way I'd forced our children to navigate an adult conflict they didn't understand. I'd gotten so caught up in justifying my choices that I'd lost sight of the fact that choices have consequences, and those consequences don't just affect the person making them. 6 months later, I was sitting in a small apartment across town, preparing for my weekly evening with Ella and Mason. Lex and I had broken up 3 weeks after the mediation. She decided that the professional and personal complications of our relationship weren't worth the ongoing drama. I was working at a new job with lower pay and fewer benefits, trying to rebuild my life from scratch. Ella was slowly warming up to me again, though she still asked pointed questions about why I'd left and whether I was planning to stay this time. Mason was more forgiving, but he'd developed a stutter that his pediatrician attributed to stress. As for Nate, he'd started dating someone, a divorce teacher named Sarah who coached Ella's soccer team. The children liked her, and from what I could observe during custody exchanges, she made Nate smile in a way I hadn't seen in years. I'd gotten what I said I wanted: freedom from a marriage that felt stagnant, the opportunity to pursue passion over security, the chance to prioritize my own happiness. But sitting alone in my apartment, preparing to spend 3 hours with children, who still seemed like strangers sometimes, I wondered if the price had been worth it. The truth was, I'd convinced myself that I was trapped in an unhappy marriage when really, I'd been trapped by my own inability to communicate, to work on problems, to consider anyone's needs but my own. I'd blamed Nate for being distant when I'd been the one pulling away. I'd accused him of taking me for granted when I'd been the one who'd stopped investing in our relationship. But it was too late to undo those choices now. All I could do was try to be a better mother to my children and hope that someday they'd understand that even when adults make terrible mistakes, it doesn't mean they love their children any less. The doorbell rang, Nate dropping off the kids for our evening together. I took a deep breath, fixed a smile on my face, and went to greet the family I'd chosen to leave behind. As I opened the door and saw Ella and Mason standing there with their overnight bags, looking uncertain and hopeful, I realized that this was my real punishment. Not the financial settlement or the custody arrangement, but the knowledge that I'd traded away something precious for something that had turned out to be worthless. And unlike the legal proceedings, there was no appeal process for that kind of loss.